Hello, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to session 2 of the week-long festival called Revisions, Decoding Technological Bias. Over the course of the next few days, the festival will present numerous lectures, discussions, and workshops focusing on the ways in which technological bias shapes our cultural realities. A network of activists, educators, critical theorists, designers, and programmers will come together to share new perspectives and develop new visions, advocating for justice and reclaiming power. Before we begin, I would like to bring attention to the good work of our partners and co-producers in this week's endeavor. City Lights is honored to be working alongside the Goethe-Institut San Francisco and Gray Area in helping bring you this remarkable program. Goethe-Institut San Francisco is the cultural arm of the Federal Republic of Germany. Their programs encourage intercultural dialogue and enable cultural involvement. They aim to strengthen the development of structures in civil society and foster worldwide mobility. It is a great pleasure to be working once again with Bettina Wodianka and her colleagues in bringing you this really exciting program. The festival is part of a project called Image and Bias, which originated with Bettina and her colleagues, and that critically engages with the cultural realities being increasingly determined by imperceptible technologies. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to our friends at Gray Area. They are the perfect medium where something like revisions can flourish. Gray Area is a cultural center and educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civic impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Nadav Hochman and his colleagues at Gray Area for all their good work. It's been a pleasure working with them in the past, and City Lights is honored and thrilled to be working with them once again on this really fantastic project. So the session today is called Against Technosolutionism: Why We Can't Regulate Our Way Out of This Mess. It is being presented by Jillian York. Jillian is International Activism Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She is also a founding member of the feminist collective Deep Lab. She has been covering questions of surveillance and freedom since the 2000s. She was named by Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 intellectuals on social media. And she has written for The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and Foreign Policy. Jillian is also the author of the recently released book, Silicon Values: The Future of Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. It's published by Verso Books. She makes her home in Berlin. So her presentation is going to be followed by a Q&A. Please do post your questions and comments in the chat function. We will also be posting additional links in the chat, which with you can buy Jillian's new book, Silicon Values. So Jillian, it is such a great pleasure to see you again. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the festival. It's so glad you could be part of this.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, I'll just jump in and I hope that we'll have a lively Q&A. I'm just gonna let everyone know straight up that I got my second vaccine yesterday and I'm feeling the effects of it. So if I stumble on any words, that's why. So I've been working on various topics around free speech and surveillance capitalism, content moderation, all of these kind of hot topics for a little over a decade now. And so I want to kind of just situate this conversation in the before times, before the pandemic. And then I'm going to really kind of kick off and start the talk at the beginning of the pandemic. So I began my work in this field around, I'd say officially around 2007, 2008. And I was, running some projects at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where we were looking at the ways in which governments around the world were censoring speech online. And specifically, what we were doing was, along with several partner organizations, we were doing actual testing in various countries around the world to determine the technical methods and do sociopolitical research as to the ways in which governments blocked websites. And this is really kind of the manner in which most governments went about trying to censor online speech in those early days. Folks who are not super familiar with this topic will still probably know about, say, China's Great Firewall, or the attempts by Iran to create an intranet, or even the various website blockings that occur around the Middle East and North Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. But really, this was when we looked at this at about 65 different countries, and I think 2/3 of them were blocking websites in some way, shape, or form. And this included several European countries, members of the EU. What was being blocked kind of ranged from pornography to criticism of the state, and depending on kind of how democratic a nation was, but it was really kind of falling around a few different categories. Pornography, like I said, state criticism, religion is obviously a big one of these, and then things like tools to get around internet censorship. That was also a common category. But again, really simple times. And over the years, I started shifting my focus from looking at the ways in which governments were censoring speech to the ways in which Silicon Valley was censoring speech. Now, often these two things go really hand in hand. And as we've seen over the past few weeks, I think, if you watch the news, you can't miss some of these stories. Twitter is under fire in India right now for taking down, criticism of the government and stuff around COVID-19. You've got Nigeria blocking Twitter because Twitter took down speech from the country's president. And of course, the debate about Trump and his accounts on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera. But when I started looking at this about 10 years ago, there were only a handful of other people doing so. I name them in my book, so I won't name them all here, but it was kind of a very, very small field. And so I kind of came in at the right place at the right time and ended up being involved in a lot of conversations with Facebook in its early days, with Twitter in its early days, with the State Department when it was kind of obsessed with internet freedom. It was a very strange time. I was quite young, and got to know a lot of the different players in this field. And as these companies got bigger, I got really interested in the amount of power that they had accumulated and consolidated. And in Mark Zuckerberg's case, kind of taken for himself. Side note, he owns, the vast majority of the shares in Facebook so that he can rule whatever happens in board decisions. And so I started to see these companies as the new gatekeepers, first chapter of the book title. And at the same time, there were other people looking at this from other angles. So I was kind of looking at it from a free speech angle. Other people were looking at the harm that these companies were perpetuating, which is very real. And I will do my best not to minimize it throughout my talk, although my focus is obviously elsewhere. And then, of course, people were also looking at the very real labor issues that arise from content moderation and corporate practices around this. And I will get into a little bit of detail around that just to kind of set the scene. So I think most people are pretty familiar at this point, but real quick, basically the way that companies moderate speech is as follows. You've got kind of 4 streams. You've got copyright, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA. If you own the copyright to something, you can file a complaint with a company to have that speech removed. You've got, the thing that most of us do, which is we click the button and flag the content for a moderator to look at. You've got automation, which is obviously the focus of this week. And so I'm going to try to bring a lot of that into this as well. But automation is, I'll get into this more as I jump into the actual headwinds of the pandemic. But automation is increasingly used not just to identify problematic content that violates a company's policies, but also to take it down before anyone even has a chance to review it or see it. And then lastly, you've got government requests. And this is something that I'll also, come back to. But governments back in those early days, when I was studying the ways in which governments blocked websites, they didn't really have the same relationship with companies that they do now. So a government couldn't just call up Facebook and say, hey, we need you to remove this thing that's criticizing us or that violates our local laws. And so the funny thing that I've only been realizing this week is that what we're seeing now, 2021, is a lot of what we were seeing between like 2008 and 2011 before the Arab uprisings, which is kind of a tipping point for all of this. Facebook and YouTube, not sure about Twitter, but Facebook and YouTube were blocked by almost a dozen, maybe even slightly more countries in that short 3-year period. Among those countries were Pakistan, Syria, Iran, I think India at one point, Turkey. And so there was this kind of cat and mouse game that began back then where companies felt that they had to be responsive. And so they created systems through which they could accept judicial and law enforcement takedown requests of speech, and then started complying first with democracies. And then as time went on, they began complying with more authoritarian countries until about 2017, we noticed that they were complying with Saudi Arabia, and then the game was over. It was everyone at the table. So that's kind of my before times prelude. And now what happened last year? So all of this was kind of working reasonably poorly, I would say, but we were making some progress at least. I've been, engaged, like I said, with a lot of these companies and with global civil society, all over the world to try to improve the processes by which these companies operate, but at the same time to, try to break them up through competition, antitrust, as well as to try to support people who are building new technologies and new ideas that are not necessarily based on surveillance capitalism, snatching up all of our data and using us to make a profit. And then March 2020 hit, and I was just about finishing writing my book. And the first thing that I thought, and apparently, so did at least 30 or 40 other people working in my field, if not more. The first thing I thought was, oh shit, like this is going to have a really negative impact on speech. And so we warned before it even happened. We actually put out a post warning that companies should not become too reliant on automation. And sure enough, my prediction was correct. What happened was that as all of these different nations went into lockdown, and of course, we've seen Asia in particular, Southeast Asia and East Asia go into stricter lockdowns because, for very good reasons, for having more serious protocols in place already from other illnesses. But at the same time, a lot of these companies base their content moderators, their laborers in the Philippines. And so the Philippines was one of the countries that did go into a serious lockdown. And as such, Facebook and Twitter and a bunch of companies were left without workers. Now, of course, you ask, why can't they just work from home like everybody else? But the companies have determined that the job that they do is both too in need of privacy protection. So, you don't want people looking at your accounts and your speech and, making these decisions from home without supervision, without protection on their device, et cetera. But the other reason, of course, is a very real concern that these companies have only recently taken seriously about the workers' mental health. Obviously, these folks have to look at some of the worst things on the internet, and these are often some poor folks working for low wages in developing countries to clean up the internet so that we in the global north don't have to look at this stuff, which is a problem in and of itself. But nevertheless, the content moderators were sent home, and in their place was machine learning algorithms and other AI. And just to set that stage a little bit, automation is good at some things. Automation is really good at saying, this is a phone, this is not a phone, and classifying it in binary as such. What automation is really bad at, on the other hand, is things like understanding the vast majority of the world's languages and correctly adjudicating things like hate speech in, say, Punjabi, which happens to be a language that Facebook does not operate in, despite it having more than 100 million speakers. It's not great at detecting nuance in things like extremism, again, hateful or dangerous or whatever speech you want to call it. All of these terms are used interchangeably at times. And it's not really good even at detecting things like gender. So, particularly as these companies profess their support for LGBTQ rights, at the same time, they're still using a very binary definition of gender to determine who's allowed to show themselves topless, for instance. And they're not very good at, say, detecting, a woman, whether she's cis or trans, from a man, from, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, automation in these circumstances doesn't work, is my thesis here. And yet it is increasingly being used. And throughout the pandemic, we've seen that increase just kind of rise exponentially to the point where, Facebook et al. Are saying that the workers aren't really going to come back. And so that's kind of the state of things at the moment. And also, at the same time, the pandemic has, as you all well know, I'm sure, has blurred offline and online in a really kind of unprecedented way. And so we're working from home. Those of us who are, I guess, fortunate enough to do so. I mean, I realize that we are fortunate, and yet at the same time, after 14 months of this, it certainly doesn't feel that way. It has blurred issues of labor. So a really, clear example of this is folks who are involved in sex work or even just sex adjacent work, burlesque dancing, for example, are being kind of systematically silenced by Silicon Valley because of both laws like Sesta Fosta, which passed in the US a couple of years ago, 2018, I think, but also because of, I'm just going to throw a link to that one, but also because of the company's own kind of moralistic leanings. So we're seeing an increase of, or an increasing pressure on these companies to remove what is kind of loosely referred to in this really Orwellian speak as harmful content or objectionable content. And what that really means is speech that is, or expression that is not illegal, but we governments can't make it illegal. So instead, we're going to create these separate bills. The UK has one, for example, around harmful content. And this bill includes a lot of things that many of us would find to be perfectly normal. And so, yeah, so that's sort of where things are at. Sorry, I really shouldn't try to pull up links while I'm speaking, should I? There we go. So that's just a little bit of detail on Sesta Fosta. And then financial transactions. That's another really interesting one. I can talk a little bit more about that maybe in the Q&A, but we're putting out a campaign soon around this. I won't get into details, but basically there's a lot of removals by like Venmo and PayPal of people doing financial transactions, people who are engaged in sex work. That's one example again, but also we're seeing a lot of these removals around just keywords in the, where you put the little keywords in the details, keywords like Palestine or Syria have caused people to lose access to their PayPal accounts, and often for no legal reason. But the pandemic has also provided cover to state and non-state actors. So there are a few interesting tidbits here. They're all a little bit disjointed from each other. So I'll do my best to throw some links in as I go. One really interesting one is, I think, you may be aware of this, I only learned about it recently, is the Antiquities Trade. So ISIS, the Islamic State, which thankfully is, well, on its way out or out, was utilizing the kind of wealth of antiquities in Syria to raise funds for their operations. And a lot of those sales were happening over Facebook to people in the United States and in Europe. And so, the effort to stop that from happening has been really complicated, not least because the US just didn't have much of an interest in stopping it. So they have created laws, of course, to try to rein in sales coming from Syria specifically, but at the same time, there is no law preventing Facebook from being the host to these sales. And so as such, they continue. Same with upticks in the drug trade, drugs being sold over social media. But it's also, like I said, those are the non-state actors. It's also provided cover to state actors. And what we've seen over the past year and a half, throughout the pandemic and slightly before it, is an uptick of regulations. These are aimed at a number of different things. So we're seeing a lot of different governments put forth national AI strategies. These are often really disjointed from one another. So you'll see, Germany has one. I know the Czech Republic has one, but they're not really linked up together. And so there's a disjointedness between these various things. Same with things like VR and AR. Regulations aimed at social media. So one of the interesting things here, I mentioned language earlier as being one of the difficulties that people face using these platforms and one of the challenges for automated technologies. But at the same time, there's the downside to this as well for the users, which is that if you are trying to report things like hate speech and harassment coming at you on Facebook, and they're not moderating speech in your language, then you're just sort of out of luck. If the automation doesn't work or it works poorly, and there's no workers who speak that language doing that job, then the harassment just keeps coming at you. And so we see these companies increasingly investing resources into solving these problems at home. And by at home, I mean in the United States, but also in other countries where they have strong offices, such as Ireland, and throughout Europe. But we're not seeing that same attention paid to other places, and again, particularly the global south. I spoke on a panel earlier this week with several people from across Africa. I think they're from Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Ghana. And I'm forgetting a country, but one of the things that all of them had in common was saying that the content moderation aimed at their languages is incredibly poor. And so things like incitement to violence around election periods proliferates on these platforms. So the way that states have responded to this is to try to force companies to have a local representative, or to force companies to take down speech within a certain period of time. And again, often automation is applied to try to solve that problem faster. I'll get a little bit more into some of these regulations when I talk about why they're not going to work. And then misinformation, disinformation. This is a really common one, of course, but we're seeing a lot of states try to tackle things like vaccine misinformation and disinformation. And maybe some of these laws are indeed well-meaning, but at the same time, the way that they're worded is often quite vague, quite overbroad. And so in trying to tackle vaccine misinformation, we may also do things like try to, stop conversations around rare illnesses from occurring on platforms where there's not a consensus amongst the medical community, or things like harm reduction with illegal drug use, which is something that these companies often target as well, in ways that is counterproductive and harmful to people. And then another big one that I've been speaking about all week at a conference, and I'm happy to answer questions on, but won't go into so much detail on right now, is the concept of extremism and terrorism. What we know, and I'll throw out the campaign that we're working on right now. What we know is that most of these Silicon Valley companies are focused on whoever the US government believes is a terrorist. And we know that that list is and has always been political. Of course, I'm not going to quibble with a lot of it. A lot of the groups on there are absolutely horrible. In fact, most of them are. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of groups that are missing from that, most notably white supremacist groups. And so you've got this kind of hyper focus and over focus with both tech companies and states and all of these kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives that have been cropping up over the past few years. People may have heard about, for example, the Christchurch Call, or the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, GIFCT. These initiatives are all aimed primarily at Islamic extremism. They're not focused on the very things that they often say that they're intended to combat. So the Christchurch Call that came about after the white supremacist attack that went after Muslims in New Zealand, and yet its efforts have been largely focused, again, on whatever the companies think is terrorism, which happens to align with what the US government believes is terrorism. And so in short, that section anyway, in short, all of these regulations are kind of coming about and aimed at all of these various issues, but what they're really doing is creating a fragmentation of the internet. And I think I skipped a point in my head a minute ago, which was, there have been a large number of bills from various nation states over the past year that are specifically, again, targeted at these social media platforms. And most of them are modeled, and I think this is really important given the context of this, most of them are modeled after a German law that came about, the Network Enforcement Act, or NetzDG. And so NetzDG is aimed at removing illegal hate speech and a couple of other illegal types of speech in Germany. The way that the law is framed is that platforms over a certain size have to remove that speech within 24 hours after it's reported. So it's a reactive law. And it has not had so many negative effects thus far. There have been some overbroad removals, but by and large, it's a law that works reasonably well in a democratic state. Whether it's necessary or not is another question. From what we've heard from the companies is that they haven't actually been receiving that many reports. The reporting queue for the users is cumbersome. It's difficult. You have to speak German, read German, and understand the law and sign your name to it. So it's quite a in-depth process. And yet what we've seen is this German law copied in almost 20 countries so far, with again, like a wide range of different nations. So India, Mauritius, Hungary, Russia, Turkey, a bunch of different nations have tried to copy what's kind of okay working in Germany, but have done it in a way that is even more severe, even more strict, even more absurd, I would say. So the Mauritian Law, for instance, again, tiny nation state with a language that is not moderated very well. It's a Creole. Their goal in doing this is to try to stop some of these horrible things from proliferating in Mauritius on these platforms. But because they're a tiny country, they can't get Facebook or Twitter to open up an office in their country. And so what they do instead is try to put in place this law that would require them to keep local copies of everything that people say on these platforms. So kind of a man-in-the-middle attack, so to speak, on the communications that people are trying to send internationally. This obviously would have a huge impact on freedom of expression, on privacy, and it would end up again, fragmenting the internet for people in these countries. And so what I would posit is I think that we're fighting a losing battle here. I think that there's been, a hyper focus over the past few years on how do we get them to take that thing down. And again, I don't want to minimize these issues because a lot of them are very, very important. But the solutions that are proposed are, in fact, technosolutionism, to reference Evgeny Morozov's work. And they're all creating this kind of fragmented internet whereby people in different nations are seeing different things than you or I might. This is back to those basics when I first started working on this, where a country would block something. Now it's even more insidious because what happens is not that the website is blocked and you get a 404 error that tells you, it's blocked, or maybe you get an actual page that the government serves you up explaining why it's blocked, but rather now it's just disappeared. And I think that this is really problematic for a few reasons, not only just, purely for freedom of expression, but also because the internet, whether we love it or not, whether we're frustrated with it and hate it at this point, tired of looking at our screens, it's become sort of an inevitable and key part of most of our lives. So many people around the world rely on it for so many things, whether it's access to knowledge that they can't get because it's censored at home, or communications with people that they can't otherwise meet or talk to, or just leveling the playing field with things like education, access to remote work. And so when a government comes in and tries to take those things away, we're essentially, we're essentially saying that it's okay for this inequality to exist. And I'm not okay with that. And so what I'm proposing is that I don't think we can tech our way out of these problems. I do think, obviously, that there's some space for regulation. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I don't think that it's technology, and I don't think that it's regulation that's going to help us flourish as we go forward as a society. I think it's each other. And I think that a lot of the things that we've seen over the past couple of years are, in fact, backfiring. They're creating more censorship. So when we talk about the example that I gave earlier around terrorism and extremism, one of the things that we're seeing pretty severely is the removal of counter speech. And so this is, to give a really concrete example, counter speech against terrorism in the very countries that are most impacted by terrorism. I was on a panel earlier today. It's a conference week, so I've been talking a lot this week. I was on a panel earlier today with someone from Lebanon who was saying that basically you can't speak about Hezbollah on Facebook from Lebanon anymore, or Twitter for that matter. You can't talk about them. And that's because the automation that's being used is overbroad and takes down not just the speech from the group itself, which may or may not be justified, but also from the people who want to discuss the role of that group in their political system. Now, again, this is a political party there with elected seats in parliament. And so that is not only, just deeply troubling that we would enable these companies to make decisions for people in another country, but I think it actually has an impact on the real political processes in other countries as well. And again, I think it's counterproductive in the sense that the very speech that we would want to see, if the goal is to eradicate terrorism, which is the goal of most of these states and these initiatives, or at least their stated goal, if we want to eradicate it, then it seems very counterproductive to censor the very people who are trying to push back against it in real and meaningful ways. And so I'll sort of end that there. I would love to take questions. I'm also happy to talk more in detail of any of these things, and I'll try to throw a few links into the chat as we go as well. But I see questions coming up already, so I'm kind of eager to take them if that's all right.
Yeah. So Peter asks, what place do I, as an individual USCN consumer, have in this discussion? What power can I exert? And I'd actually like to couple that with a question that I had. I mean, in relation to activists working towards social change, do you see areas where those looking to make impact can focus their energies? Are there voids that need to be filled?
Yeah, absolutely. So I said that I would mention this campaign that we're running right now, and this is just one example. It may not be your issue area, and that's okay. But it's an example of a way that I think that more people can get involved in a really meaningful way that actually helps people who are trying to use these platforms for good and really being stifled. So this campaign is specific to Palestine. Again, if it's not your political issue, that's okay. But what we're looking at is Facebook is systematically taking down speech related to documentation of brutality, again, counter speech in some cases, but also just people talking about the political situation there. Facebook has been censoring things, to give a really concrete example, like the term Al-Aqsa, which is the name of a very key mosque, very holy place, but also happens to be a name that's contained within a US designated terrorist group, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. And that was an example that BuzzFeed did a story on last week. I can try to find that link as well. And so this is, like I said, one campaign. We've got another one coming up. Oh, I guess I'm sorry, I've been posting them only to panelists.
I had that problem earlier myself.
I will
it's a very
repost.
Unforgiving interface.
Yep, yeah, I can repost the ones from earlier as well, or feel free to if you can see them. So yeah, like I said, this is just one campaign. We've also got a very different one coming up, targeting one of the payment processors next week. But we do these all the time. And this is one way that people can get involved. So whether you want to volunteer to help us out on one of these or sign on to our petitions, like I said, I mean, I'm not completely against regulation. I think that there is a role for it, although I generally oppose it when it's aimed at taking down expression, again, with some exceptions. But one of the things that I've seen over the past decade is that when we apply pressure from the people to these companies, they do listen, which is really interesting, right? Because they're corporations. And, we've historically, and I believe firmly that we should rely on, not on corporations to regulate speech and not on corporations to regulate anything really. And yet at the same time, these companies do behave like state actors. And so I feel that we should treat them as such and protest against them. So in 2015, for example, we had, this was not my campaign, so I say we as in the collective we. There was a campaign against Facebook that was aimed at getting them to accept people's pseudonyms in really specific circumstances. So we didn't win the whole fight, but basically there had been a number of drag performers in the Bay Area, as well as I think some trans folks who were having difficulty using their chosen names on Facebook because it requires your real name, which they meant birth name. So Facebook actually changed its policy after a series of protests that included protesting in front of their headquarters in Menlo Park. And that was a total success. Now it's a partial success anyway. They've changed their policy to an authentic names policy, which is completely accepting of transgender people who are using a different first name. It's still difficult for people who use one name, for example, mononyms. It can be difficult for people in other countries. But again, this was an example of a time where we were actually able to effectively push change toward a company in that way. So yeah, definitely feel free to get in touch with me, EFF, or many of the other organizations that work on these issues. There's a lot of room there for folks to get involved.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that kind of like cross paths with each other. An anonymous participant asks, how does the current tech deplatforming of conservatives or anti-vaccination views factor into this story? And then Peter asks, once again, how does this kind of censorship intersect with things that cause genuine harm, revenge porn? What is the place for regulations that you are, speaking about, limiting?
Sure. So to the first question, so the tech deplatforming of conservatives is a really interesting story, and it's a frustrating one for me, to be honest, as somebody who's worked on this for a decade, because conservatives are not censored at any higher rate than anyone else. They are taken down. There have been, I've documented myself, numerous cases where they were wrongfully taken down, some of them ridiculously so. There was one where a guy was taken down for literally just posting a Bible quote. So it happens, it absolutely happens, it's absolutely real, but it's not, there's no bias against conservatives, and it's not, again, it's not any more severe than people all over the world who are regularly deplatformed. Deplatforming is something that crosses every political boundary, every gender boundary, every national boundary. And so I think that the issue with conservatives has been more in the news for the past years. And I do think that there was a lot of bias in the decision to remove Trump. So I'll talk about that briefly. And the bias is not against Trump per se. I'm no fan of his, to be honest, but the bias is in US centrism. So there have been a lot of political figures all over the world who have violated the rules of the platforms. And yet Trump was the only one that got removed from two different platforms, maybe more, Facebook and Twitter. I don't think he was taken down from YouTube. There was a whole, Facebook Oversight Board had this whole thing where they accepted, thousands of submissions and added an extension period to look at that case, while there were other more important, in my opinion, cases coming into their queue. And so if anything, I think that the excessive media attention to this issue has made it seem a lot more than it actually is. So again, it's real, but it's not any more so. But the vaccination thing is interesting. That one I will talk about a little bit more. So, I mean, I'm pro-vaccine. Obviously, I got mine yesterday. I think we should all get them. But I think that there's a really troubling trend here with the way in which they've done this. So number one, I'm in Germany, and on my Instagram, I was getting CDC information the entire year. So I live in Germany, where we have a different institute, the Robert Koch Institute, and I actually prefer their guidelines. They were quicker on the masks than the CDC was, and they've been more cautious with a lot of other things than the CDC was. And yet, despite that, for some reason, I'm getting this US-centric policy thing thrown into everything, sometimes even covering up more valuable information than what their information does. So I don't think that it's, I think the companies have to do something about this in some way. I think that there is a lot of really troubling disinformation being spread, including by people who should know better. And yet, when we hyper focus on things like this, we have to consider a couple things. One, the long-term impact. Is censoring this going to really make people get their vaccines? I don't think so. I think that there are better ways to counter it. So I would much rather see fact checking. I would much rather see counter speech. Medical professionals, like Reddit had a great example of this, where on Reddit you had doctors coming in and talking to people on these threads, using persuasion rather than censorship as a tactic. That's all great. And so the other issue here is just medical misinformation more broadly. I think I did say this briefly at the top of the talk, but the vaccine science is a bit clearer. There's a lot of medical issues where the science is less clear, or there's political issues involved. So again, the political example, drugs. I think a lot of the conversation in the United States around drugs comes from a political position, not from a scientific one. There's a lot of like, this will kill you, instead of a focus on harm reduction. And I think that is costing us human lives. And so when companies or states choose to censor harm reduction information, I think that that's just absolutely backfiring. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to look at the censorship of anti-vaccine stuff and see how maybe we might have conversations about illnesses that are not entirely one really good example is MECFS, where the medical professions in different countries are on completely different pages about this illness. Long COVID, another one. So I think that that's an area where we do have to ask, do we want authorities stepping in and choosing what is or is not acceptable dialogue around this? Or do we want to allow for free and open debate with authorities coming in and talking with us? And I would much prefer the latter in that circumstance. And then to Peter's question, how does this kind of censorship intersect with things that cause genuine harm, like revenge porn? So revenge porn is genuinely harmful. And I don't even like to use the word porn. It's it's not porn, it's unsolicited posting of people's private images in most cases. But at the same time, focusing on taking these down has resulted in a much broader censorship of the human body. So one of the reasons that platforms censor nudity is to try to take down revenge porn. And often it's really ineffective. And so what happens is the revenge porn stays up, but the diagrams of the nude body or the burlesque dancers or the mastectomy photos or the breastfeeding photos, all of that stuff comes down because they're trying to apply automation to a problem that requires human touch. Touch was probably the wrong word there, that requires human intervention. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't regulate this. I'm saying that I have not seen a single good regulation proposed in the United States or elsewhere for that matter around revenge porn. And one of the links that I posted in the chat comes from Pakistan, where there's a really strong revenge porn law in place that has not been effective at all. And I think that that's a really great story to read to try to understand some of the problems here. I know some of the folks who've been working on this in the background. But yeah, I don't have all the solutions, I'm not going to lie, but I think that we do need creative solutions. So one of the regulations that I am absolutely behind, at least in part, is the Digital Services Act coming up in the EU, which has a lot of, we lobbied a lot on this, to be perfectly frank, but which has components to it that would require companies to be more transparent, to require ample notice to users when they are removing things. So again, we're not trying to tell companies you can't regulate this or that, but rather that they provide ample notice to every user in every circumstance in the same way that a user would be notified when they violate the law and given a path for due process or recourse. So that's the biggest area for regulation that I see a positive happening in. Again, I think that there are some of these necessities. So when it came to like the terrorism stuff, a lot of the reason that this increase in attention happened was because of the rise of the Islamic State. And I don't think there's a person who's not a member of ISIS in the entire world who would disagree that ISIS is a scourge that we need to get rid of. And yet, more attention seems to be paid to, again, to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to groups that do have a quasi-state role or a full state role than is actually paid to some of these other more violent and problematic groups, and less involved groups. So I'll end that there. I'm seeing other questions.
Yeah. Michael Cohen asks, are there alternatives to social media platforms that can be developed?
Yes. So, I mean, I think the first thing is the business model, right? Like we need to look really closely at the business model of these platforms. Shoshana Zuboff's work does this much better than I do. Obviously the title of my book references her book, and that's on purpose. I think people should read her work as well. And I wanted to kind of, tie that or thread that needle. Really struggling with words today. So one of the things that we need to look at is how do we create a new business model that is not reliant on sucking up all of our data and using it for advertising, using it to target us even further. And Silicon Valley doesn't want that. Let's be very clear. They don't want a new business model because this one is making people rich. Mark Zuckerberg's lining his pockets, buying up people's property in Hawaii illegally, got all of that going on. And so I think that that's the first thing we have to look at really carefully. What that model looks like, I'm not a business person, so this is something I struggle with, but we're seeing right now all of these subscription newsletters, for example. How come we haven't seen a subscription-based social media project take off? How come we haven't seen a decentralized project take off? And the answer again is that a lot of people would rather, who build technology would rather get rich than create something for the people. But I do think that there are possibilities there, and we have to figure out, where that money is going to come from. Because I think that there's people ready to build it. And I also think that we are going to see a battle kind of come, I hate to use the word battle, I really do, but coming up in the next few years. So the US and the EU are kind of standing together against China right now when it comes to tech. And I mean, there's a lot of problems with Chinese social media. It is far more censored than the US ones, for example. And that's just only one of the issues. But at the same time, this stance has created a situation that's absolutely untenable for people outside of the US, Europe, and China. So if you're, and this is trade focused, sorry, again, it's not my expertise, so I'm just kind of referencing it, but if you're in Africa, for example, if you're an African nation, you're going to end up having to choose between US and EU products or Chinese products. And that's really not a good deal for anyone involved. Having to make that choice is going to, again, fragment our states even more, deny opportunities to people in those countries, and deny access to knowledge, to information, to conversation, communication, et cetera. And so I think that we do have to think about this in terms of where the next ideas are going to come from. And for me, a lot of the coolest ideas I'm seeing right now are coming from the African continent. They are coming from the Middle East and North Africa, but it's really hard for people to compete. There's just these platforms are so entrenched. And so, part of the solution there is antitrust competition, breaking them up. It's not going to solve all the speech problems, but I do think that it will contribute to a healthier ecosystem. And then I'm happy to answer these other ones as well. Do you want me to? I don't know if you want me to.
Yeah, go
for
it.
I should just keep going.
Yeah.
The Oversight Board. Yeah. So the Oversight Board, I funny enough, I spoke about this on a panel earlier this week too. With, I think, one of the members of the board, Julio Ono, who runs Internet Sans Frontières. I forget what country she's originally from. She's from the African continent, based in Boston, which is where I think of her as being from. But she and I and Evelyn Duick, who's a researcher at Harvard, we kind of debated this earlier this week. And it's funny because they asked us, the moderator asked us where we would rank it on a scale of 1 to 10. We all typed our answers at the same time. And I was surprised to find that my ranking came out higher than other people's. So I was really, really critical of the Oversight Board in the beginning. For full disclosure, I was at one of the consultations. They did 7 global consultations when they created it. And by global, I will say they flew Americans into Berlin, which I really don't understand because they did 2 in the US and the other 5 were elsewhere. But nevertheless, they did these consultations. They had like 40 people at each one where we looked at potential cases. These were like 2 days long. We met people from the company. They were at our tables. We really got into the weeds. We gave them a lot of great ideas and they took almost none of them. So my faith in Facebook is not great, but at the same time, they created the board and then they made it independent. So it's funded by a trust from Facebook, but it is independent from Facebook, which means that it operates on its own. And now it will be recruiting new members and et cetera, et cetera. So my critiques are quickly, the independence thing is kind of in question, although I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that they are in fact independent in their decision making. The board very quickly, I'll go to the pros just to keep it clearer. So cons, that's one con. Another con is it's 25%, maybe even more Americans, which is really weird because Facebook's user base is like less than 10% Americans. So again, really US centric, and I've got a real problem with that. When they chose to recruit their 21st member, they went for yet another US lawyer. So I've got problems with all of those things. And also the fact that these are, it's treated like a Supreme Court, but these cases do not create case law. They're only, the decisions that are made only apply to the specific case at hand. So if they they've made some really interesting decisions. I don't know if you've looked at them closely. One of them was around, I think I mentioned Punjabi as a language earlier. One of them was around something in India that where the board actually recommended the same things that I've been saying for a long time, which is, you've got to have moderation in this language. You've got 30 million people in India, I think 100 to 110 million worldwide speaking it. It's ridiculous that you don't have this already. They didn't use those words, but I do. So like I said, their decisions have been quite positive and quite helpful, based in international human rights laws and frameworks. Again, the recommendations are really interesting. They've changed the charter. So now they don't just focus on takedowns, but also what are called leave ups. I hate that. But basically they're looking at things that maybe, so originally they were meant to look at things that were taken down, but shouldn't have. Now they're also looking at things that were left up, but shouldn't have. But again, most of the recommendations or I think all of the submissions for what cases they accept, or most or all, not clear, comes from Facebook itself. So Facebook is still the determining factor in what they look at. So I think it's flawed. I don't think it's terrible. I don't necessarily think it's a template. I think that, an enterprising company could do better than this, but it's a good start and it's a step in the right direction. So that's kind of where I'm landing these days. So the number that I gave it out of 10 was a 7. And surprisingly, the people who've been less critical than I have gave it a 5 and a 6. So because I was feeling optimistic that day. And then, is it conceivable to imagine fully human moderation replacing automation? I think the scale is in fact unsolvable. So I actually believe that content moderation is a failed proposition entirely, and I will fight that one to the end. It just simply can't work at scale. And so we're going to have to find different solutions to dealing with these issues. One of the things that I've always found kind of ridiculous is that Facebook not only moderates stuff that's publicly posted, they also moderate private groups. So if you're a group of people, Facebook can still be applying automation to the stuff in your chosen group of people. That's really invasive to me. I understand, of course, that private groups can flourish around all sorts of horrible things. And yes, I do think it's acceptable to apply automation for things like child sexual abuse imagery, which goes beyond a mere speech issue and towards actual harm of human beings. There's other cases like that as well. But at the same time, I think that giving us more tools to moderate our own spaces is a net positive, because as we've seen, when companies do this, Reddit being a really good example here, Reddit allows, again, Reddit's not perfect, but they allow people to moderate their own subreddits, and they also have an upvote downvote system. So you do see in a lot of those spaces, the positive stuff rising to the top, or the good stuff, the hearty stuff rising to the top, and the bad stuff getting downvoted. You also see you see very strict subreddits where moderators take this very seriously. And so ultimately what I think is the best thing is for us to have more choice. But right now what we have is a concentration of companies that all follow each other in circles, to the point where we've got this really kind of homogenous online space. And again, of course, other websites still exist, but good luck reaching people through them. And I don't know where to go next.
Well, you had mentioned earlier that you're a part of this project that was just launched. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So that's the campaign, the Palestine campaign, and I'd be happy to talk through it briefly. So I was working with we're all at the bottom, we're all listed there, but I think it's like 16 organizations. And actually, to be perfectly frank, it was like a 40-person signal group. That's how we organize these days in the land of working from home. And so around early May, as the forced evictions were happening of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, Palestinians started, and I've got a lot of Palestinians in my network. I've been involved in those causes for a long time, but also there's some really strong digital rights groups that work on not just on Palestine, but also on some of these broader issues and are based there, as well as elsewhere in that region. And so I was, in this chat with some people, and they were saying, hey, we're seeing like videos of these evictions being taken down from Instagram. We're seeing, people just talking about this stuff. And again, there's no question here. None of this was hate speech. None of it was terrorism. None of it was violence. Like none of this broke the rules is what I'm trying to say. And yet a bunch of it was just being taken down in huge swaths. And so on May 6th, activists reported that was happening. Instagram did quickly respond, and they blamed it on a technical error, which is something that happens all the time. And as the week went on, we realized that it wasn't just Palestine. It was also, strangely enough, Colombia, Canada, and specifically Indigenous people in Canada, and Brazil, and maybe one other country. And so I organized a call between some Palestinians and some Colombians. And when they started talking to each other, it was actually a really great call, and quite funny because everyone talked so fast. But it was when they started talking to each other, we realized that they were seeing the exact same kind of censorship happening in their country. And what we realized was probably that they were test markets for some automation tool. And so as time went on, the various groups that we were working with started to collect reports from people and analyze those reports. And while there were some things that violated the rules, the vast majority of stuff being taken down did not. And so for the past month or so almost, we've been working together to create this campaign where we're asking Facebook for 5 things. And these are a little complex, but basically a public audit of all the rules related to Palestine, although I would broaden that to say all the rules, period. Government request transparency. So this is transparency about what they're receiving from not just the Israeli government and its cyber unit, which is a particularly troublesome unit that works specifically to hyper focus on Palestinian content, but also from other governments. and ensuring that users have the ability to appeal those decisions. Automation transparency, again, like what classifiers are being used, error rates. Dangerous organizations, and this is Facebook's kind of doublespeak for terrorist groups, where it has a rule that says that you can't post things if you're a dangerous individual or organization. This is also the rule that was used to take down Trump, incidentally. He was classified as a dangerous individual, but interestingly enough, he was not classified that way in any public fashion, nor did he know that he was a dangerous individual. They just applied this rule to him at the last minute and said, okay, that's that. And this is how they treat other groups too. So it's not that Facebook is out there saying, hey, this is the US or the UN list of terrorist groups, and this is who we take down. They're just applying this rule to anyone that their staff decides that day is a terrorist group or dangerous group. So yeah, really doublespeak. And then lastly, commitment to co-design. And this is something that's so important that I hear from people all over the world. And something where if you do know people in tech companies, advocating for this would mean so much to so many people. We really believe that co-design processes with civil society groups are absolutely necessary to improve different policies and processes. And so this one is again focused on Palestine, but this is an ask that we've had to the companies for a long time on a number of things. And to be frank, it does happen. There was a co-design process recently with a company around creating better tools for women in particular, not just women, but mostly women, to defend themselves against harassment brigades, like mass harassment happening. And it was a really cool process, but we need more of that. And we need more of that in the Global South in particular.
Well, on that note, we are just about out of time. Jillian, thank you so much for being part of Revisions. I mean, this has been a really awesome presentation and just given us so much to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank everyone in the room for joining us. Glad you could all be here. I'd like to remind everyone that we are posting links to where you can buy Jillian's new book, Silicon Values. I'd also like to remind everyone this session will be followed by another session tomorrow, Friday, June the 11th at 12 noon Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be with Maureen Webb. Her presentation is called Coding Democracy, How Hackers Are Disrupting Power, Surveillance, and Authoritarianism. If you haven't already, please do register for that. We have an entire week's worth of events coming out, so please do visit the Revisions web portal to see the whole calendar. Also, I should let you know tonight's talk is going to be rebroadcast on the Gray Area website in case you know anyone who missed it, or if you'd like to just watch it again. So this event has been sponsored by the City Lights Foundation. It's a 501c nonprofit carrying on the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti. It fosters an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events, publishing programs, and educational outreach are dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you again all for joining us. Hope to see you all again soon. Be well.